Our Bible begins with a story about how God created the world, the universe, humanity, and in the very beginning, things were as they were meant to be. In the Hebrew language, this is referred to as shalom. Mankind lived in right relationship with God, with self, with others, with creation. But in a few short chapters, we know the story. Things went sideways. Adam and Eve decided not to do things the way God invited them to do it, to put their own desires and thoughts first and to live outside of God's plan for their lives. And when they did that, the Bible refers to this as sin, and brokenness entered into that relationship with God. That trust that God had given them was broken. And that fractured all of those relationships. And really the biblical story from that point on is the story of how God was working to bring everything back together. How where shalom fell apart, he had a plan to bring this holistic vision back together. And he had a plan right from the very beginning. And so it doesn't take very long as you're reading the Bible to start to get a glimpse of what God had in mind. And we get to Genesis 15. And in Genesis 15, there's a guy named Abraham. And God chooses Abraham in some ways to start again. He says, I want to create a people that are going to be my people. And Abraham, I'm going to start with you. And Abraham was 75 years old. And God says to him, your descendants, they're going to be many. They're going to be as many as the stars in the sky. And I'm going to create a people. I'm going to create a nation. You're going to have a land. And you're going to be my people. And I'm going to be your God. And Abraham had some questions because he was 75 years old. We got anybody 75 years old in here or older? Okay, and so God told them, the 75-year-old, you're going to have a baby. I don't know how you would feel at 75 years old. Hey, this is just beginning. So this is what he's told. And he's like, and Abraham's like, there's going to be a nation, many descendants. I don't even have a kid yet. And God's like, don't worry, I got a plan for you. And Abraham asked the obvious question. He's like, how am I going to know that this is true? How do I know that this is actually going to happen? And God says, well, let's make a covenant together. And this covenant is going to be my promise that I am going to follow through on what I promised. And covenant literally means to cut in half. And this is what would happen. They would, when you made a covenant in the ancient world, you would get animals and you would actually cut those animals in half. And so, they gathered animals and Abraham cut them up. And we had in Genesis 15, you'll see that there was an aisle of animals and half the body here, half the body there. And the idea of the covenant was you would walk through the middle aisle. You'd walk through the middle aisle of these two separate animals with the person that you're entering into this covenant relationship, these covenant promises with. And the idea was, as you walk through the aisle, the concept is, may what happened to these animals happen to me if I break my end of the covenant. And so Abraham cuts these animals, expecting to enter into this covenant relationship with God. And then in Genesis 15, it tells us that Abraham fell into a deep sleep. And as he starts to wake up and he's coming to, he sees that there is this smoking fire pot with a blazing torch representing the presence of God. And what he sees is that this God's presence, this flaming torch, starts going through the aisle of the animals all by itself without Abraham. In many ways, this is as if God was saying, if I don't hold my end of the bargain, or if you don't hold your end of the bargain, the covenant, Abraham, may what happened to these animals happen to me. And God takes the responsibility of both parties. And so God begins this journey of calling people to himself. He enters into covenant and he takes the responsibility of that covenant on himself. And you fast forward a few hundred years and just like God promised, Abraham did have a kid and then they had kids and there was many, many children. And these descendants of Abraham, long story short, they ended up becoming slaves in Egypt. And so there was many of them that were slaves under the Egyptians and they were slaves there for 400 years. And you can imagine if God had a promise for you, a destiny for you, and you found yourself in slavery, they're asking questions. Lord, where are you? What happened to the promises? It's been hundreds of years and we're slaves in Egypt. This is not what you promised us. This is not the covenant that you entered into with us as your people. And so they're crying out to God for a deliverer. And so God sends Moses to be his deliverer, to rescue God's people that he had covenant relationship with, to bring them out of Egypt. And so before Moses goes into Egypt to rescue the Israelites, God articulates four promises. And he promises that he's going to rescue them, he's going to free them, he's going to redeem them, and he's going to take them to be his own people. And we see these promises in Exodus 6. He says, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. So believe me, I'm going to come and I'm going to rescue you. And then he says, I will free you from being slaves to them. You're going to experience freedom. There's been generation after generation under the Egyptians where you haven't experienced freedom, and that time is ending, and I'm bringing you out, and I'm going to rescue you. You're going to have freedom, and I'm going to redeem you. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm, with mighty acts of judgment. So I'm going to judge the Egyptians. I'm going to bring judgment on them so they will break and you will be freed, and I'm going to purchase you back. That's what redeem means. I'm going to purchase you back and bring you back to myself, back to the plan that I have for you, and I'm going to take you as my own people. I will be your God. You're going to become a nation. You're going to become my family, the way I promised your ancestor Abraham. So rescue, freedom, redemption, this family. This is what God promises to his people, and that Moses was going to be the one that was going to come and deliver them. And so Moses enters into Egypt, and if you're familiar with the Exodus story, you'll know that when Moses comes in, there are a bunch of plagues that God brings upon the Egyptians because Pharaoh had a hard heart and he wasn't willing to let God's people go. And so slowly, he starts to release his grip on God's people because God brings these plagues to Egypt. There's 10 rounds of plagues. The Passover event would be the last event, but there's 10 rounds, and there was water to blood, there was frogs, there was boils, there was hail, and so plague after plague comes, and then Pharaoh still won't relent. He still won't let go. And so we get to the Passover event, and the Passover event is where God tells the people in Egypt that the angel of death is going to come, and it's going to take the firstborn male from every household. And if you want to be exempt from this, you must take the blood of a lamb and put it on the doorpost of your house. And if the angel of death comes by and it sees the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, it's going to pass over that house. So that's where we get the phrase Passover from. And so the Egyptians, they didn't put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. God's people, the Israelites did. They put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and the angel of death came and it passed over the house. And so in Egypt, there was wailing and there was crying because families woke up in the morning and the oldest male child in each household died. And that was the last plague where Pharaoh finally said, that's it. Just take him. Moses, you can take them. I let them go. And so Moses took his people out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, and they were entering into God's story, his promise for them. And so this event was so central to the Jewish people because this articulated, this kind of marked them, what God had done, how he'd been faithful to his promise, but also marked them as becoming his people and stepping into the promise and the freedom and the rescue that he said that he was going to bring to them. And so every year, God wanted to make sure that they didn't forget this event. This salvation story was critical to who they were and revealing to them who God was. And so he said, once a year, get together and share a Passover meal. And so the Passover meal had different elements to the meal. There was unleavened bread. It was like this big cracker-like bread that you could break. There was bitter herbs. There was a bone. All the elements of the Passover meal represented different parts of the story. The bone that was there on the plate represented the suffering. There was romaine lettuce that represented new things, spring. There was paisley dipped in salt water, which represents the tears that people had cried while they were waiting for God. There was hard-boiled eggs. And so all these different elements of the meal represented different things for God's people. But along with the food elements, there was 5 cups of wine at this Passover meal. 5 cups of wine. And as they went through the meal, they were reciting and remembering the story that God had done generation after generation as they had this meal together. And so they're eating the elements of the meal, reminding themselves of the story. And as they got to each one of the cups, they were reminded of the covenant promises that God had given Moses in Exodus 6. And so they had one cup that represented the rescue. And they would, at the beginning of the meal, drink from this cup, where God said, I am the Lord your God, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And they would drink that. They remember that promise. And then they would remember the promise that God was going to free them from slavery. As the meal went on, they came to the second cup. They knew how to have a good time. And before you get too worried, this is juice, not wine. So as I make my way through here, you're like, whoa, sermon's getting really good. And so they continue through the meal, and they get to the third cup, the cup of redemption, and they would remember the promise from Exodus 6 that God was going to redeem them with great acts of judgment, that God had rescued them, that he had come against their enemies and had purchased them back to be his people. And then we get to the fourth cup, and they would remember that God had called them, that he didn't just rescue them for the sake of it, but he rescued them for a purpose, to be a nation, to be God's family, to walk in relationship with one another and with him. So they would tell the story as they went through the meal together, and they remember God's promises as they drank the cup together. And so this happened year after year as God's people remembered the story and tried to remind their children and their children's children of the story and the salvation history of what God had done. And so you fast forward 1,500 some years, and you have Jesus on the scene with some disciples. And we enter into the story around Passover time, that one time once a year where they gather together to remember the Passover story and to eat this meal together. And so Jesus and his disciples are outside of Jerusalem, and they were headed to Jerusalem because the disciples had gotten to this point where they believed that Jesus was the Messiah. They believed that Jesus was going to be the king, the new Moses, that would conquer their enemies just like Moses in the past came and conquered the Egyptians. Except instead of the Egyptians, now it was the Romans. And so they enter into Jerusalem. They're anticipating some kind of event. They don't know exactly how it's going to unfold, but they're coming towards Jerusalem thinking this is the moment where we experience another type of Passover, where God's going to bring judgment on my enemies. And so they're traveling to Jerusalem. They're outside of Jerusalem. They come together with this expectation of what Jesus is going to do when he gets there, and they're eating this meal together. And so it's time for them to eat the Passover meal, and they're sitting around the table, remembering the story of how God had rescued his people in the past. And the 5 cups are sitting there in front of them, and they're going through them, remembering the promises of rescue, of freedom, of redemption, and how God brought them to be his people, a nation, a family. And so this is the scene that Jesus has with his disciples. And in Mark 14, it tells us a story. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, this unleavened bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." And they're scratching their head, they're like, wait a second, like this, for 1,500 years, like we've been doing this meal. That's not your body, that represents something else. And Jesus is throwing them a little bit of a curveball. He's saying, this is my body. And then he took a cup. And we know from the other gospel accounts, this was after supper. So it was probably at this point in the meal, it was that third cup that we talked about, the cup of redemption. He took the cup and he said, he gave them thanks and he gave it to them and they all drank from it. And he says that this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many, he said to them. And so Jesus goes through starting to reinterpret this Passover meal, and the disciples are wondering, what is he talking about? What is this all about? And so he goes through the 4 cups, reinterpreting, giving a different angle, a different perspective, that he is going to rescue, he's going to free, he's going to redeem, and he's going to bring together the family of God. And some of you think that I can't count. There was actually 5 cups in the Passover meal. And as you gathered around the meal, you drank from 4 of the cups. Those 4 cups represented the promises of Exodus 6 that we've mentioned. But throughout the history of Israel, there's a debate among rabbis whether or not there should be a 5th cup. And the thought was that even though God had rescued them from the Egyptians, they weren't actually totally free yet. They weren't completely rescued yet. I mean, God had rescued them miraculously, but then they went into the wilderness. And then a short time after that, they were conquered by the Assyrians. And then they were conquered by the Babylonians. And then they were conquered by the Greeks. And then they were conquered by the Romans, which is the era that Jesus is having this meal with his disciples. And it kind of seemed that God had these promises for them in Exodus 6, and even though he did something miraculous at a certain point in history, it wasn't yet fulfilled. It hadn't yet been completed. And so, yes, they drank these 4 cups remembering what God had done, but they had a 5th cup that was there because they recognized that there was something yet that God had to do. They referred to this as the cup of Elijah, because they believed that Elijah was going to come before the Messiah, and then when the Messiah came, he would complete and fulfill everything. And so they had these 5 cups, and they would set the table, and where the 5th cup was, they would leave a spot that was empty, and they said, we're leaving this for Elijah because Elijah is going to come, and when Elijah comes, the Messiah will come, and everything will be made right again. And so they had an empty seat with a cup that they never drank from, as an anticipation of what God was yet to do. As you read through the Old Testament, you'll recognize that there's a cup that is referred to multiple times. And over time, in some traditions, people began to associate this 5th cup, this Elijah cup, with this other cup that was referred to in the Old Testament. We see it in Jeremiah 25. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, said to me, take from my hand this cup filled with the wine of my wrath, and make all the nations to whom I send you drink it. When they drink it, they will stagger and go mad because of the sword I will send among them. And so part of the reason God hadn't fulfilled everything he promised is because we were under the thumb of the Egyptians, and now it's the Assyrians. Now it's the Babylonians. And so we need God to come and do again what he did to bring his judgment on the nations that are oppressing us. Psalm 75, it is God who judges. He brings one down, he exalts another. In the hand of the Lord is a what? A cup full of foaming wine mixed with spices. He pours it out, and all the wicked of the earth drink it down to its very last dregs, which means last drop. There's nothing left. Pour out your wrath on the nations that do not acknowledge you, on the kingdoms that do not call on your name, for they have devoured Jacob and devastated his homeland. So the tradition developed that for some, that this cup represented not only the thing that God had yet to do, but the reason why God hadn't yet done it is because they were still under the oppression of some kind of foreign enemy. And so what would happen is some of them would take this 5th cup and they would walk through the house, open the door, and they would pour the cup out outside of their door as a prayer, asking God to pour out his judgment and his wrath on the enemies, on their enemies, on God's enemies. And so you can imagine the disciples that are there in the Passover meal with Jesus have this kind of expectation that God is going to do something like he did then and bring judgment upon the Romans. However, if you read the Old Testament and you're paying attention to the prophets, you will notice that it's not quite that simple. The reason that God's people were perpetually struggling, perpetually never really got to the fulfillment of the promises, was not because of the enemies of God that were out there, but because of the things that were against God in here. Prophet after prophet, even though they gave words of judgment and warning to other nations, gave words over and over again of judgment and warning to Israel itself. You know, it's not the nations that are out there. The reason that you are oppressed and you're enslaved is because you have walked away from God, walked away from his ways. You haven't done the things that he's called you to do. And you've done the things that he has told you not to do. You have put yourself in the center. You have worshiped other gods and put other gods before him. And as you read the biblical account, you recognize that it is the sin within the human heart that was the enemy of God. And that the thing that was opposed to God weren't just nations out there, but it was actually sin that was in here. So how does a God who creates a covenant, a loving covenantal God who creates a covenant with a group of people whom their hearts are bent against God, how does he fulfill his covenant to rescue them, to free them, to redeem them, when not only are there enemies of God out there, but there's enemies of God in here? How does a holy God who is without sin bring in his family who is full of sin, who has broken the covenant over and over and over again? How does the God of Abraham, who walks through the pieces of the animals, who said, may what happened to them happen to me, respond in a situation like this? And perhaps if we want to get personal on this Good Friday, which we should, is how does a loving God who wants to walk in a relationship with you and me, who is also holy, go about making a way for that to happen? And so Jesus eats this meal with his disciples. He drinks the 4 cups. The disciples drink the 4 cups. And they get to the end of the meal, and the story continues. In Mark 14, it says they went to a place called Gethsemane. And Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death, he said to them. Stay here and keep watch. Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if it's possible that the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, which is a term of intimacy. It's a term of intimate relationship. It's like daddy. He's praying to his dad. He's talking to his dad, and he says, everything is possible for you. And then he prays this prayer. We know that he went away 3 times on this event in Gethsemane, praying. He says, take what? Take this cup. Take this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will. Which cup is he referring to? Take the cup of rescue from me? No, that's not it. Freedom, redemption, relationship. He's not referring to those cups. Jesus is referring to the cup of judgment. Jesus prays, Father, take this cup from me. He's overwhelmed to the point of sorrow, of taking on the consequences of sin, the judgment for every human being, for everyone who's ever lived. The weight of that separation from the Father. And so he prays, Father, take this cup from me. But he says, not as I will, but as you will. And we know that from the very beginning, all the way back to Genesis 15, that God had a plan that he was going to fulfill the covenant, even if the other party broke it. And so Jesus goes to the cross, mocked, whipped, crucified with nails through the wrist, through the feet, dying a criminal's death on a cross, an excruciating, painful death where you die of suffocation because you're just exhausted, because every time you breathe, you have to stand on your feet or pull up on your hands, and you can imagine the pain of that. And so eventually, people who are hanging on a cross, they don't die of the nails, they die of being suffocated because they no longer can breathe. And the cross was meant to be a mockery. The cross was meant to show the power of Rome, show the power of death, show that there was nothing more powerful than this. And Jesus takes this cup and he drinks it, and he drinks it fully. He drinks it to the last dregs, every drop of it, for his enemies. And while he's hanging on the cross, he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And he drinks it for his enemies. Because the truth is this, that every human being is loved by God, and every human being, because of sin, is an enemy of God. And that's the paradox of the Good Friday story. That's the piece that the disciples missed. You know, that the Romans were the bad guys, and they realized in retrospect, when they look back on this Easter weekend, that they needed saving. They needed redemption. They needed forgiveness. And so Jesus dies for the Romans and for his disciples, for their enemies and for them, for you and for me. Why? Because he wants a covenant relationship with us. Now, there's a mystery here on Good Friday, because when we talk about this fifth cup and the wrath of God and the judgment of God, the Christian belief throughout history has been in a triune God, in a Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, completely unified in one but three separate persons. And there's a temptation that we have to split the Trinity on Good Friday and say, you know, God was bringing punishment and judgment onto his Son. But when we split the Trinity, we actually miss the beauty and the profound, powerful mystery of the cross, because what we see on Good Friday is not just a human hanging on the cross, but we see God himself hanging on the cross. We see an echo of Genesis 15, a God who walks through the animals that says, if the other party cannot uphold their end of the bargain, I will take on the consequences of that broken covenantal relationship myself. And so where's God on Good Friday? God is hanging on a cross. Jesus reveals to us a God who would rather die than to kill his enemies. A God that is fully love, that will pour himself out completely for those whom he loves, for you and for I. Jesus drinks the cup that we deserve so that we could drink the cups that we don't deserve. That's the exchange. That's the exchange. In the garden, Jesus picks up the fifth cup, and at the cross, he drinks it, and he drinks it fully. He didn't dilute it. He didn't delay it. He didn't pass it off to someone else. He drinks it all the way fully to the last drop so that the cup that should have been yours doesn't have to be yours. And now because that he drank that cup, he offers you a different one. Not a cup of judgment, but a cup of grace. He offers you rescue. He offers you freedom. He offers you redemption, that he purchases you back into his family, into relationship. Redemption, that means that no matter what your story is, it's not the end of your story. He can rewrite your story no matter what you've done or what you haven't done. He doesn't give you a cup of judgment, but a cup of grace. And so the question isn't on Good Friday, will Jesus drink the fifth cup? We already know the answer to that. That's why we're here, because he did. The question on Good Friday is, will you receive the cup that he offers? Will you receive the cup that he offers? And so as we respond to that action that Jesus made 2,000 years ago, we come to a new Passover table, a communion table, the Lord's Supper, an echo of that meal that he had with the disciples, the one that he reframes, the one that he redeems. And he says, this is my body, and it was broken. It was cut in half for you. Because I knew that you couldn't uphold your end of the deal. And so I did on your behalf. This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for you. I drank that fifth cup all the way to its last drop because I didn't want to be your enemy. I wanted to be your friend. I wanted to be your father. And so as the band leads us into the next song, I invite you not just to do this because it's a rote practice that we do in church. We come to the communion table because it's a present day offering that Jesus still gives 2,000 years later. For those who are willing to admit that they need forgiveness. For those who are willing to admit that Jesus is the center of their lives, to profess that. For those who are willing to let Jesus be the center, the Lord of their life, Jesus says, come take it, my body broken, my blood spilled. Because in exchange, I give you rescue from the tyranny, not of the Egyptians or the Romans or the, fill in the blank, from the tyranny of sin and death, I rescue. I give you freedom. I redeem your story, and I bring you into the family. So as the band leads us, I invite you to come forward, to receive the cup that Jesus has for you because he took the cup that you and I ought to have taken. Would you stand with me? As you come to the tables, we have a table in front of each section. We're just going to invite you to move clockwise from your left to right in the section that you were in. There's no obligation or pressure to come and receive from the Lord's table, but it is an invitation. It's an open invitation to anyone who is ready for that exchange. And so we come to the table to receive forgiveness, to proclaim Jesus as Lord, and as an act of thanksgiving and realignment of our lives to be centered around him. So Jesus, we thank you for your body broken, your blood spilled. We thank you that you drank that cup of judgment, that cup of the consequences of sin, the consequences of things that we have done and the things that we ought to have done that we didn't do. Lord, we thank you from the very beginning that you were a good God, that you knew that we wouldn't be able to walk perfectly in relationship with you. Jesus, we thank you that you came 2,000 years ago. You entered time and space and history and walked in our shoes. You were tempted just as we are, yet you were without sin. Jesus, we acknowledge that you are the perfect sacrificial lamb that takes away the sins of the world today and forever. And so we come before you to your table, remembering your broken body, your spilled blood. And we say, thank you for forgiveness. Thank you for what you've done. Lord, we'll take that exchange. Thank you for your rescue, your freedom, your redemption, and that you've brought us into your family. Pray this, Jesus, in your name. Amen.